In this presentation, I wanted to give you an overview of the approach we've taken to produce essentially risk-based data sharing agreements. What that means is we custom develop the data sharing agreements to take into account the overall risk that the data custodian is taking in releasing that information. And by customizing it, I mean the conditions and stipulations and constraints on the data recipient are custom developed in order to manage the risk. So it's not a boilerplate kind of one-size-fits-all data sharing agreement, but we actually do a risk assessment to produce the data sharing agreement. As a background, I will just go through our methodology quickly. The basic idea when you're releasing data for secondary purposes is to measure or evaluate three things at the bottom here: the mitigating controls, the invasion of privacy, and the motives and capacity. And we've developed various checklists for doing so. But the mitigating controls looks at the security and privacy practices that the data recipient has in place in their organization. Invasion of privacy is essentially a test of the sensitivity of the data, the amount of harm that we've done to the patients if the data is inappropriately disclosed, and the motives and capacity looks at the motives and capacity of the data recipient to re-identify the data. So in a realistic scenario, the custodian would evaluate those three things at the bottom using the checklists, and based on that they would get some sense of the overall risk of disclosing the data to this particular recipient, and they would de-identify the data accordingly. Sometimes it happens that the amount of de-identification is too much and the data recipient is unhappy, so then we would go back to the mitigating controls and negotiate with the data recipient to see whether they'd be able to increase the practices they commit to putting in place. And if they increase the practice they agree to put in place, then the amount of de-identification may be reduced, and you go through this iterative cycle until everybody's happy. And then in the data sharing agreement, the mitigating controls that have been agreed to are included as part of one of the schedules in the data sharing agreement. So that's the overall idea. And now I'll show you how we have implemented this within the context of the privacy analytics tool. So here we are in the privacy analytics tool, and to start off with, I will load a data set. This is a provincial data set that consists of 126,000 births in Ontario for the 06-07 year. And on the right here you will see our threshold. This is the amount of risk that the data custodian is willing to tolerate, 0.2. This expert system that is going to come up now allows you to determine the amount of mitigating controls, the motives and capacity of the data recipient, and apply the invasion of privacy test. And there's a series of questions and checklists that are included here. But the main point here is that you have these mitigating controls that you agree to with the data recipient. So let's say here we're going to allow surprise audits, and having third-party audits as part of the agreement, and so on. And of course, the more things you agree to do, the less the identification that can be tolerated by the data custodian. So let's say we go through this process and we're done. Now I'm going to select the data set and I'm going to de-identify it. So the first step in the identification in the privacy analytics tool is to do the risk assessment, and as you will see here, the risk of de-identification for this data set is quite high, and then we'll apply the de-identification algorithm to de-identify this data set. Okay. So here it is, and we'll apply the de-identification to it, and the three variables that we selected were the postal code, the baby's date of birth, and the age. We'll de-identify here. That'll run for about 10 or 15 seconds to produce an optimal solution. And then we'll make the assumption that everybody's happy with this, so the mitigating controls were satisfactory to the data recipient. They've agreed to make the investment to implement these practices in place, and that the amount of de-identification is acceptable as well. So the generalization to the variables is acceptable to the data recipient. They'll be able to achieve their analysis objectives with that data set. So we'll just do one iteration basically rather than go through a number of iterations, which is typically what would happen in practice. So here we have the data set. The postal code has been generalized from the full postal code to one character. The baby's date of birth has been changed to month and year instead of the full date of birth, and the age, the mother's age, is constant. It's not modified. So now we'll go. Um, uh, Actually, we'll go to reports, which will give us a list of options to select from um, in terms of data sharing agreements. And there are two data sharing agreements that are included as part of the system. The first one is for an external agent. This is an Ontario-specific term, but essentially any subcontractor would be considered an agent, or for research. We'll assume it's for research, so now it'll produce a Word document with a custom data sharing agreement. I mean, certain pieces of information still have to be added, like the name of the data recipient and so on. But essentially, the data sharing agreement is automatically completed, and I'll go through some of the sections here for you. Just to illustrate. So the yellow highlighted pieces need to be completed, like the name of the custodian, the name of the data recipient, and so on. But the interesting part here is Schedule A of the data sharing agreement already automatically includes the variables that have been de-identified. So the postal code, it explains that the data release will include the postal code that's been generalized to only one character. The baby's birth date has been generalized to month and year, and the mother's age is kept as it is, as 1 year interval. And then here are all the other variables that are included in the data set that have not been modified or have not been generalized. This is part of the schedule A of the agreement, and it explicitly lists all the variables that will be included with the data release and the level of generalization. And the second section here are all the mitigating controls that have been agreed to. So as part of the risk assessment, these are the mitigating controls that the data recipient has agreed to implement, and they're included also here as part of the data sharing agreement. So now really all the custodian needs to do is fill in the names and the addresses, and the data sharing agreement is done, which stipulates the conditions on the release, the exact variables, and the practices that are expected from the data recipient.